Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Cumsty Fowler, and today we're going to do the second part of our work around changing our questions to change our leadership. So if by some chance you haven't done part one, please wait to do this until you have done part one. What am I going to cover? Well, I am going to introduce you to the concept of switching questions, and that's from Dr. Marilee Adams' book that you're familiar with. But then I'm going to introduce you to two additional skills. One is listening for the commitment behind the complaint. That comes from Dr. Monica Sharma. And then finally, the art of the somersault question. And that comes from Jerry Sternan and his colleagues in the world of positive deviance. But first, we're going to start with a reflection. Since completing Changing Our Questions Part 1, what have you noticed about either the questions you ask yourselves and others, or the questions that others are asking you? And then to what extent have you been able to change the questions that you ask yourself and other people? And I'm going to invite the facilitator to pause the video, and when you've had your conversation and shared your insights, I'll be ready to continue the training with you. I think the question I would ask is, were you surprised by how much time we actually spend in judger mindset versus learner mindset? Was that surprising to you that it's pretty common, isn't it? Yeah. Now, I just want to say that in a regulatory agency, you're being asked to judge people against criteria. This is not what we're talking about. Having to make a judgment about somebody based on clear criteria is something completely different. So using judgment is one thing. What we're trying to avoid is this judging of people's worth and ideas and situations. Were you clear about that? So I'm not asking you to give up the work that you do to evaluate people's compliance, but we're asking you to think about how we approach this in a more learner and inquiring mindset. And how often did you find yourselves in the judger pit? I still laugh when I work with my colleagues who've been practicing this for some years now, and they'll walk into a meeting and they'll say, "Oh my goodness me, yesterday I was so in the judger pit." The key thing here is, though, that they knew that's where they were, and with the skills that we'll practice, they were able to get themselves out. Remember, though, we've talked a lot about what happens when we start hearing those background conversations or feeling that we could fail, and how the minute we perceive that, we're more likely to upregulate, and that doesn't go well for us. So when you notice yourself in judger, also notice how you respond. Because as Dr. Adams says, we don't want to go judger on our judger. So if I notice myself thinking something judgmental, I don't want to be saying, "Now, Carolyn, you're judging again. Like, what's wrong with you that you keep judging?" I want to bring myself to it with curiosity. I might say, that's kind of judger. Where did that come from? What was that about? Because ultimately, judger's never going away. Remember, that judger is there to protect you, but we overuse it, right? So we know that part of our brain is there to protect us, but sometimes it overprotects us because it over picks up on risk and over perceives threat. So what we need to recognize is that we don't want to discount it, because at times when that voice in your head says, this is not a good place to be right now, and it literally means it, like you're physically unsafe, we want that judger voice to tell us, get out of here. But in our daily interactions, we want to be compassionate when we notice ourselves in judges so that we're able to stay in learner. Now, we all slip into it at times, right? It's just the case. And what I would ask you to do is be compassionate with yourself. Notice with curiosity and try to switch out of that place of judgment. And if you remember the work we did on noticing ourselves when we upregulate, it's really important that we learn to move into learner with curiosity, because we can't understand what's happening. We can't develop insight unless we can get back up here into our wise parent executive brain in our prefrontal cortex. Now, if you remember from part one, the most important part of the choice map is that switching lane. Because no matter how close you are to the judger pit, we always have a choice of switching. Now, in Change Your Questions, Change Your Life, the third edition, which is the book that the cohort used, Dr. Adams has a whole chapter on switching questions, and it's chapter 6. And these are some examples of switching questions. I'm going to show you a lot more in a couple of slides, but these are some that are in her book, but these are also some that I know that many of my colleagues find comfortable to use. If I find myself, for example, getting upset with somebody and feeling that I'm getting pretty judgmental or I'm pretty demanding or I'm just irritated, whether it's with a child or a spouse, I can say, is this who I choose to be in this moment? Like, is this the me I want to be? I can also ask, well, what is that other person thinking or feeling, either about the situation or about how I'm responding? What are the facts in this situation? And what can I learn from it? Like, what is there to learn here? I may be so sure and so certain that I'm right, but maybe there's something that I can learn from this experience. And then what's possible here? Remember we talked about those books where we said, oh, I know how this is going to end. Well, maybe when I ask a switching question, I can say, well, maybe you don't know how this is going to end. Like, what is actually possible here? And maybe what's possible if I choose to be more grounded in this moment? And then also we have the what's possible, and then we could also ask ourselves, but what is the best choice right now? What's the best choice for me and for the other people in this moment at this time? So as you go through Change Your Questions, Change Your Life, and as you think about shifting questions, you'll find that there are literally dozens and dozens of shifting questions. But what Dr. Adams recommends, excuse me, is that the shifting questions you practice should feel natural to you and easy to use, because one size does not fit all. The other thing that you will probably notice is that certain questions help you switch from judger to learner, maybe in a work setting, whereas in a home setting or in a setting with people with whom you're in a relationship, you may find that other questions work better for you. So what we recommend is you simply just try some of these questions on for size, and ultimately you won't have to think about them. Ultimately, as you practice them, the questions that are the most comfortable for you will be the ones that they're up at the surface and they're easily accessible to you. Dr. Adams outlines what she calls 12 questions for success, and these are in her book. And these are questions that either you can use personally, like where you're saying, what do I want? They are also questions that you could use collectively with your team. So as a team strategizing, for example, you could say, well, what do we want? So you'll see these questions are about what we want, they're about assumptions, they're issues of what I'm responsible for, because sometimes this is not saying what am I responsible for because I don't want to be responsible. Sometimes this is like, well, what am I responsible for? Because some of the things that I may be being stressed by are things for which I'm actually not responsible. I don't even have any control over them. And so actually being concerned about them may be a waste of energy. How else can I think about it? And this is why it's so helpful for us often to have these conversations in groups, because we each bring different perspectives and we're able to offer really interesting and different insights into what may be going on. This idea of getting to the empathy, it's not us versus them. It's, well, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they wanting? What are they needing? Is there something we're avoiding here or something we're missing? Because you could be missing it, but you could actually be avoiding it, maybe subconsciously, but you're avoiding it. And then what can I learn from this in terms of this person or situation? What can I learn from this mistake? And very importantly, what can I learn from this success? Because I want to be able to store that to memory so that it's there for me in future. And let's get to the last 5 of the questions. Then once I've done that sort of what am I missing, what are the assumptions, etc., then I should say, well, what questions should I be asking now? Asking myself or asking of others? And how can we work to turn this into a win-win situation? So it doesn't have to be either or, winner takes all. How can we resolve this in a way that everybody wins? Keeping that focus on what's possible here. What are my choices? What are our choices? And then maybe what are the action steps that just make the most sense for us right now moving forward? And sometimes those action steps are actions. And sometimes the action steps may be to say, maybe you don't have the information you need right now to make this action, to make this decision or to take this action. It's important to pay attention to that if you're hearing, yeah, it's not time to act. Having said that, I want to caution you not to feel that you have to have 100% of the information about every decision, because some decisions are not high-risk decisions, and you don't need to invest masses and masses and masses of time thinking through every piece of them. Now I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice developing learner questions. And I have a quote on the top of the slide from Dr. Adams who says, "A question not asked is a door not opened." And I don't know how many times you've had that experience where something happens and you think, oh gosh, if I'd only thought to ask that question, I could have avoided this issue that I'm having. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to think about your work, and you can choose to think about it individually or in the small group, whatever makes most sense for you, this group that's sitting here today. Identify a challenge that you're facing, and think about what learner questions could you ask about this situation that would help you gain insight and have a better sense of what are the choices that you have and what are the steps that you need to take next. And when you've had that conversation and developed some learner questions, I invite you to rejoin me and we'll carry on our conversation. Well, I promised you at the beginning of this module that I was going to introduce you not only to switching questions, but to two other brief concepts. And let me start with listening for the commitment behind the complaint. I'm sharing this because in the leadership development cohort, this was interesting to your colleagues, particularly because you very, very often have to listen to complaints, whether they're from your colleagues or from the people with whom you interact in the public. So let's visit this one first. And then both of them, both the positive deviance and the listening for commitment behind the complaint, are really helping us learn to ask assets and opportunity-focused questions. And that might not seem obvious starting out, but hopefully by the time I explain it, it will be clear. Let's explore what we mean by listening to the commitment behind the complaint. Dr. Sharma says that basically when people are complaining about something, very often there's a commitment behind it. So let's think about this. Let's go back into parent mode. And I say to my child, I really need you to be paying attention to me when I tell you that the homework needs to get done. You can't be on the television. You can't be watching your video because I need you to be getting the homework done. And the kids are like, yeah, Mom, like I hear it. Like Mom's always complaining. Well, let's think about it. What is the motivation? What is the commitment that I have for my child that's behind that complaint, right? So the commitment is that they're going to succeed, that potentially they have choices about what they do in the next step of their careers or their academic lives. So even though it's landing in a very, negative and complaining and controlling kind of way, it's motivated by something that's really quite positive. And a story I told to the LDC that I'm actually going to tell you now relates to two people who were working at my hospital. One was a very senior surgeon, and one was somebody working in the supply area of the hospital. In other words, the person who has to make sure that the equipment that's necessary for patient care is delivered to the unit. And if you're like any other settings, we had a problem with having pumps available. And the details of the story are not important. It's the spirit behind the story. And so I heard from my colleagues who had witnessed this exchange that there was a challenge in that a patient needed this piece of equipment. It wasn't available, or it was available, but it hadn't been delivered. And the surgeon called down to the supply area of the hospital and was literally yelling into the phone at the lady on the other end of the phone who was the supervisor on duty. Now, this supervisor, by her own admission in the work that we'd done together, had said, I'm fine until someone yells at me, but when they yell at me, I'm like, I'm done. I react, I retaliate, I upregulate. And she had wonderful insight into this, and her colleagues would be like, yeah, that's pretty much how she is. Like she's calm until she isn't, and then the lid flips. And so we'd practiced thinking about, well, what's the commitment behind this complaint? And we'd role-played it. And this is how the story unfolded, that the surgeon is busy yelling at this supervisor, and the supervisor said, I can hear how upset you are. And he's like, well, of course I'm upset. And she says, and I think that the reason you're so upset is because you're so committed to having a good outcome for your patient. And he was just like, well, of course. And she said, well, I need to assure you that I am committed to that exact same outcome, that this patient does well. However, while you're shouting at me, we cannot work together to make sure that that outcome happens for this patient. So help me understand the situation and let me see what I can do to work with you to resolve it. And she described feeling unbelievably proud of herself in being able to do this. But the reason it came to our attention, and the reason it was something that we actually debriefed on because it was so positive, was that the surgeon who'd been yelling at our colleague turned around and said, you know what? You're right, and I am so sorry that I yelled at you. And just like that, the situation was resolved, and they were able to work together to make sure that what really needed to happen was that the patient got what they needed. And so this for me is one of the most powerful switching strategies in upregulation and in conflict. Because if you think about it, we don't disagree, we don't get into conflict, and we don't fight about things that we don't care about. If I don't care, oh well. So if you think about conflict is a very high energy situation. But that energy can be transferred. If you can, through your personal mastery, redirect that energy, it can be used for good. And so the passion that was leading to the shouting and the anger, once transferred into attention to solution finding, becomes a powerful change agent. And so the switching question that I find very, very helpful in these situations is this one. What is this really about? So if somebody comes in, they're upset, they're confrontational, maybe they're behaving in a way that's just not like they usually behave. Instead of judging them or saying, oh gosh, like what's wrong with you? Just to pause for a moment and say, what's this really about? Because we know that very often when things land on us that we feel are about us or are disrespectful or demeaning or inconsiderate, most of the time it was never about you at all. This behavior or this sort of verbal attack that's coming your way, it's really not about you at all. It's about something else. Now, especially when you pick up the telephone and somebody is on the other end of that telephone and they just want to complain. They didn't know it was going to be you on the end of the phone when you picked up. This is not about you. And so as they start going at you, what I'm going to recommend is that you pause, you breathe out, and you ask yourself the question, what is this really about? I can hear they're upset, but what is this really actually about? And sometimes the way we deal with this is to acknowledge that they're upset. Don't blame them. Just say, I can hear that this is upsetting or this is distressing to you, and I want to work with you to resolve it. So could you please help me understand a little bit more about this situation? And in just taking control of the space, you're able to downregulate the whole exchange. Now, the second piece of this is positive deviance. I promised you've heard me talk about positive deviance before, but Jerry Sternin, the father of positive deviance, is somebody that I really hope that you will consider when you think about how to improve your questions. Now, let me just quickly go over the definition of positive deviance, because really what it's about is that you have certain individuals or groups whose uncommon behaviors and strategies enable them to find better solutions to problems than their peers, and this is the most important thing, while having access to the same resources and facing similar or worse challenges. So it's not that they're favored or more gifted or more resourced. They have the same resources, and yet they are able to achieve better outcomes. And then they continue and say that this approach is very much assets-based problem solving, and it's community-driven or team-driven, organizationally driven. And what it does is it lets the group discover those successful behaviors and strategies and then develop a plan of action to promote their adoption by all concerned. Now, if you think about this, this is counterintuitive in the way that we work, because usually the way we work is what's not working, who's not complying, what's wrong, and then we devote our attention to understanding why people are not complying, what's wrong, etc., etc. I'd like you to just hold that thought for a second, because you might be asking yourself, yeah, well, what's this actually got to do with helping us to ask better questions? Well, a question is only helpful if it gives you useful and usable insight. And so the first wonderful takeaway from positive deviance is what Sternin calls TBU temptation, the true but useless information. We know that things are not going well. We know that people are not in compliance. We know that we don't have enough resources. We know that we don't have enough time. We know this. And asking more questions about this will only give us more completely true but useless information. It's not telling us anything we don't know or anything we don't understand. And most importantly, it's not giving us the information we need to find the solutions to the challenges. That's number one. Number two, it teaches us to learn to ask questions about the assets and the opportunities. It's not asking us to ignore risk and challenge. That's not what it's asking us to do, but it's asking us in the midst of this challenge or problem to pay attention to the fact that there are potential assets and there are opportunities. And I love this quote: "We're all faced with a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations." All right? So maybe you have a very charismatic, very talkative person, very social, and you just think of them as a challenge because they can't get done what they need to get done. They're always distracting people and so on. That's true. However, what are the skills and the abilities of this person that could be better leveraged and used? And are there questions that you need to ask about them or yourselves or their work they're doing that would allow them to be positioned in a way that they're more able to play to their strengths and be productive? Now, if we look at this picture, there are two pictures, right? So we know that in one of the pictures is a beautiful young woman who has a fur coat around her shoulders. She has a feather coming out of her, obviously, presumably from a hat. That's the positive way of looking at this picture, the lovely young woman. The other way of looking at it is that we have a rather old hag with a very large nose, a very jutty chin, her head's down like this. Now, very often we can only see one or the other. And I'm not going to ask who sees which one. However, there are ways that we can teach people to notice the positive. So if you're somebody who's very fixated on seeing the old crone lady with a big nose and a chin down and the negative, you could say, okay, that's fine, but look at her nose, right? Now, if you see that little lash that's on the left-hand side of her nose, imagine that's the eyelash of the young woman, and the young woman is in profile. All you're seeing is the left-hand side of her face. And then under her nose, instead of where you see the mouth and the chin and the slash for the jaw, that's actually her neck, and she's wearing a necklace around her neck. And then you see the V of her neck inside her coat. So we can actually train you to notice the other perspective. And that's what positive deviance is asking us to do. It's asking us to pay attention to noticing the positive parts of a situation, and especially the opportunities. Now, there's one questioning strategy that provides the foundation for every effective positive change initiative, and that is called the somersault question. And Sternen has described this, and I think that I've mentioned it in a previous training. It's the question he asked in a village where there were high levels of malnutrition in children. And their concern was decreased resource, the fact that they couldn't feed the kids, they didn't have enough, a lot of true but useless. We don't have what we need to keep these kids from starving. And the somersault question he describes is this one. He says, is it possible that in this village there are children who are healthy and thriving? And of course, as I've shared before, the answer was yes. And then the work, of course, was to find out who those children were and why they were thriving. And so you'll see this is a learner question. Is it possible? So maybe if you're saying we're never ever going to get this right, we're never going to get this sorted, we're never going to get this resolved, well, if that's what we say, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe we need to stop for a moment and say, well, is it actually possible that there's another way to get this accomplished? Somersault questions move us then from a scarcity or a deficits perspective into what we call a bright spot perspective, and that's the positive assets perspective. And so even though this doesn't look like a very big piece of light on this tiny little bright spot in the universe, this is the work that we do, because once I understand what it is about this bright spot in my team or my organization or my community, as I learn about this, as I learn about my bright spot, I'm then able to amplify the light, amplify the brightness throughout my team and organization. And so now, as we come to the close, I'm going to invite you once again to practice this. If you don't have time today, maybe this is something that you'd like to do on another occasion. I'll leave it up to the facilitator to make that call. But what we're going to do is you're going to go back and revisit the learner questions that you developed earlier on in this module. And I'd like you to identify no more than 2 questions. And if you want to work as a group, that's absolutely perfect. If you're a big group, maybe just break up into pods of 2 to 4. Now, just take those 1 to 2 questions and make sure you pick questions that focus on challenges or deficits. Like what don't we have, or what can't we do, or what are the barriers? And I would like you to work together to transform those questions into assets and opportunities focused somersault questions. Like, is it possible? Or do we have strengths? Or do we have better ways of doing it? Or who do we have that's able to manage it? Challenge yourselves to turn those questions over so that you're leading with assets and opportunities. This is not easy. This is probably the strategy that your colleagues in the cohort found the most challenging. And so what I would suggest is that if you're finding it challenging to turn the question around, maybe pause for a moment and ask yourself the question, well, if I'm struggling to think about positive questions about this situation, how else could I think about this situation? Maybe turn it around a little bit. It's not going to come immediately. It's not going to be something that's intuitive. However, I will promise you that with practice, it becomes almost natural. Once you've had the opportunity to do this, please rejoin me. And if today is not the day that you're going to take the time to do this, I'll share my final slide with you. I have 3 quotations here on the slide about questions. The one, and I know that so many of these ancient quotes seem to forget that women have any wisdom, but we'll just indulge Claude Levi-Strauss right now. The wise man doesn't give the right answers. He poses the right questions. And then from Tony Robbins, successful people ask better questions, and as a result, they get better answers. The final quote is the one that I'd like you to sit with for a moment and take away with you. Your mind will answer most questions if you learn to relax and wait for the answer. Now, in this situation, I have asked you not to come up with answers, but to come up with questions. And if you're struggling to come up with these questions, the answer to the question, what's the right question, is still an answer. So I invite you, as you think about transforming your questions for the leadership work that you do, give yourself a little space. Just sit with it for a while. And ultimately, that wise, learner, strengths-focused question will reveal itself to you. And as a result, so will the insights that you need to make change. I wish you everything of the best with this practice, and I hope that it's of service to you, your team, and the people that you serve.